that Islamic extremism is one of the #1 priorities of the Home Office. It's that and extreme right terrorism.
What proportion of MI5's caseload is far-right extremism?
I don't know that number. You can ask me that number. But the point is, the Home Office has identified that both of those two...
These are really important matters, with respect. And so by conflating these issues, by chucking far-right in there, it doesn't do anyone any favours. The vast, vast majority, in excess of 90% of MI5's caseload is Islamist terrorism. So
The entire panel's sheer visceral reaction to reforms Zia Yusuf is a sight to behold. In this debate, we had the Labour MP who tried to take him on. Then we have the Conservative MP who was hopelessly trying to compete with him to get voters back. And best of all was this woman who looked utterly disgusted and demoralised the entire debate. She was from the organisation disingenuously named Best for Britain. This was on their website. They are left-wing activists trying to associate their movement with patriotism while promoting explicitly anti-British policies, a very devious tactic. As we know, the establishment has certain things that go against its diversity agenda, therefore they must not be mentioned. Zia Yusuf comes along and just takes a sledgehammer to the entire conversation. He just speaks his mind and they hate him for it. Every time the establishment talk about extremism in general, I've noticed they always use far-right terrorism as the default example now. That is not by accident. They are insidiously trying to make far-right terrorism the first thing that comes into people's minds when they think of extremism. But there was no changing of the narrative while Yusuf was on the show. You can clearly see they are terrified of talking about Islamic terrorism and would rather discuss the far right. He mercilessly destroys the Labour MP after she does just that and then tries to backtrack. What is terrifying is if Zia Yusuf wasn't on the show, they'd have made this whole debate about the far right, knives bought on Amazon, and the use of language. We don't need to imagine the Liberal establishment's conversations when they are behind closed doors. Take a watch.
What they've done.
Can you see those arguments, Zia? Dan Jarvis, the minister there, was saying the government has rejected this advice, adding, as Polly was saying, Islamist extremism followed by far-right extremism are the biggest threats we face. Do you accept that?
that is not supported by the fact. If you look at Hansard, you will see, unfortunately, not trying to trigger anyone, this is just a fact, the vast majority of MI5's caseload is not far-right terrorism, it's Islamist terrorism. So that is a fact, and you can go and look at it on Hansard.
Yeah, but he was, well...
So that's the first point.
But he said Islamist extremism followed...
We have a government that is willing to do the most extraordinary gymnastics in order to not actually address the problem. This particular report, for example, talked about how it used the word alleged when it was describing the grooming gangs, where there have been hundreds of people who have been convicted of those atrocious crimes. We know there's been an almighty cover-up. Labour have admitted this by doing some partial, allowing some partial inquiries, albeit not the full, transparent national inquiry that Reform are demanding. So what we have is a government that is willing to essentially sacrifice the lives of its own people, as far as we're concerned, at the altar of this virtue signalling diversity. It's time for common sense. It's time for us to have officials who actually do their jobs in terms of keeping people safe. The final point I'll make is the monster who carried out the Southport attacks was reported to Prevent on 3 separate occasions. Who has been fired at Prevent? Who has paid a price for this inside anywhere inside the state system? Those little girls, it was one of the most atrocious crimes we could ever have imagined.
All right,
There's been nobody, not a single person funded by the taxpayer whose job it was to keep those little girls alive has paid any penalty for.
Well, Polly, and should there be?
Well, I mean, there are 2 things that are going on. There's the review of the Prevent strategy in order to be able to identify where there might have been things that need to change about the way the Prevent programme works. And there is also the public inquiry into all of the state failures that resulted in that. Because there were a number of times when that Southport killer was in contact with state authorities and indeed charities as well, and nothing was done. That is the appalling consequence. Those are the appalling consequences is that atrocity in Southport, and we need to understand where and how people need to take responsibility in order to be able to avoid these kind of things happening in the future. But I would want to clarify on the record and correct the record, Zia, that Islamic extremism is one of the #1 priorities of the Home Office, as confirmed just in the Commons by my colleague Dan Jarvis.
Right.
It's that and extreme right terrorism.
What proportion of MI5's caseload is far-right extremism?
I don't know that number. You can
then
ask
you
me
can't
that
talk-
number.
then you shouldn't
But the
be talking
point
about
is,
these
the Home
topics
Office
then,
has
because
identified
these
that
are
both
really
of those
important
two.
matters with respect. And so by conflating these issues, by chucking far-right in there, it doesn't do anyone any favours. The vast, vast majority, in excess of 90%
And that is
of
one of the
MI5's caseload
that is one of the
Islamist terrorism.
priorities
So
of
throwing in
Home
far-right, throwing in far-right is deeply unhelpful if we want to have
Well, but Zia, it is
Islamic
included.
extreme
It is
terrorism
included.
is included in the priorities of the Home Office.
Right.
That is the clarification on the record that I want to make.
Ben, does the definition need to change? Does it need to be expanded?
Just to add a slightly different take on it from the report, what I find is, I think it's good that, well, I hope they go all the way and kind of push entirely back against this report, but it's good to hear the government distance itself very, very quickly. What I find interesting about it is this is a report that's been developed within the civil service by officials, and I actually think it shows an insight behind the curtain as to how officialdom has managed this type of process in the future. We can go to the Southport, we can go to multiple public body failures, but it also goes to this kind of stasis. The idea that we should act as extremism when you say that there is two-tier policing in this country is an absolute farce. If anybody says that there isn't two-tier policing in this country, they are not telling you the truth. The fact that somebody can go to prison and be arrested for alleging and calling somebody a paedophile online, but actual paedophiles are not going to prison, I'm sorry, but that is a two-tier system.
Well,
the fact that the Home Office thinks that now should be regulated and looked at as an extremist view shows where the Home Office is at. And I'm not suggesting that's a political point. I'm suggesting from a civil service Home Office point of view, that is a real problem and a real concern that politicians need to be looking at.
Well, Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, says the officials that produce this factually incorrect garbage, this is the review we're talking about, are unfit to serve the public. They should be fired.
I think that one thing that gets lost in a lot of this is acknowledging that behaviours are incredibly important in this. And what do I mean when I say behaviours? I do mean that it is incumbent upon not just the government, but everybody, politicians, political commentators, the media, to understand that when they say something or write a column about something, that in itself is a behaviour if it seeks to inflame and cause more social division and put certain communities at risk. Is that extremism? No, of course it isn't. A definition is just a definition. Of course, it means how resources get allocated, and so it has a legal framework there. But no definition is going to please everybody. What matters is that we're addressing the behaviours that cause the harm rather than one based on definitions. And I just would remind people that the language that we all use, particularly those of us on this panel and people that come on this show and people who write in newspapers, need to be really, really careful about the language that they use, because that can tip over into some of the dreadful behaviours that we have seen over the summer riots, etc., that aren't necessarily rooted in ideology.
Well,